Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Trees to Know in Oregon launch party. I see most folks have their microphones muted, so thank you so much for that. Feel free to enter in the chat where you're coming from so we can see where everybody's from today. My name is Nicole Strong, and I'm going to be your moderator. I am the Central Regional Director for Oregon State University Extension. But as a former forestry and wildlife educator in Extension, I've had many occasions to use the Trees to Know in Oregon and Washington book. So I'm really honored and excited to be here with you all this evening. Let me introduce to you our speakers. First, our author, Dr. Ed Jensen. Ed has spent his entire career teaching students at Oregon State University about forests and trees, and we're really excited to learn from him tonight. In addition to Trees to Know, Ed is the author of Shrubs to Know in Pacific Northwest Forests, which is also available from us at Oregon State University. Also with us this evening is Dr. Dave Shaw. He is an OSU Extension Forest Health Specialist, and he worked with Ed on the new chapter in this book on climate change. So welcome to you both, Ed and Dave. One more thing to keep track of logistics-wise this evening, hi Anne, is that we're gonna have a couple giveaways of the new book. So keep your ears, eyes peeled for the owl hoot, and we will randomly select a few winners and privately message you in the chat to let you know that you won so we can get your address and send you the book. All right, we don't want to waste any more time on intro shenanigans, so let's move forward. Ed, I have right here my 2010 copy, well used, of Trees to Know and well lent out copy of Trees to Know in Oregon right here. What's new about this new edition and why should I buy it?
Good question. How do I know? Anyway, thanks for that nice introduction. And I want to welcome probably on the order of 1,000 viewers from near and far. So we're very excited about that. And it's reassuring to know that many people are interested in trees and Trees to Know. So thank you all for joining us here tonight. So what's new in this book from the 2000 edition? I've added about 20 species, 8 of which are rare and native to southwestern Oregon. And they come up across the border from California into that very the 2 southern counties of Oregon. And about 12, I guess, new ornamental trees, just because I thought they were interesting and might catch people's attention. Dave and I have included a discussion on how changing climate might affect Northwest forests, although there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding that. We'll talk in part about the uncertainty. We've updated a number of scientific names, and we've updated the section on champion trees, because as we all know, trees grow taller and trees get shorter as they age and they decay and they fall apart and they get blown over by the wind. So those are the 4 or 5 new things in the 2020 edition.
All right, I'm going to reserve mine ASAP. You mentioned a few cool things about this book, Ed, but what do you think makes it special?
Well, I think the author makes it very special, frankly. Okay, a little more serious.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Okay, thank you. I think it's special because the goal of this book from its very beginning 70 years ago has been to make knowledge about trees more accessible to people, especially those who would consider themselves novices rather than experts. So a goal has been to take the intimidating factor out of identifying trees and make it accessible to people. In fact, the original author, Charlie Ross, when he was a young boy growing up in North Carolina, and that would have been about 1915 to 1920, learned to identify trees from a book called Trees to Know in North Carolina. And that book was so influential in his life that when he came to Oregon and became OSU's first extension forester, he wanted to recreate that opportunity for young people in Oregon. And so I've tried to maintain that approach throughout time. I think another thing is that the 2 simple to use plant identification keys that are in the book take some of the mystery out of tree identification by showing it as a process rather than some kind of black magic. So there's an organized way that you can go about identifying trees without carrying everything in your head. And while the book uses color photographs and clear descriptions to aid in identification, a lot of people think that the descriptions of natural history and the ecological role of the trees and forests is what excites them the most. And so in a way, this is a gateway book, a gateway from trees into the forest. So thank you.
That's great.
So I guess it's to me. And so next, today I'm going to try and unlock a bit of the mystery involved in identifying trees, and at the same time show you how Trees to Know can help you with that so that you don't have to carry all the information around in your head. So I often get the question, well, what do you look for when identifying trees? And a lot of people, it's easy to get confused if you're trying to identify trees from the form or the aura of the tree. And through 40 years of teaching, I've found that it helps a great deal if you break down the tree into individual characteristics that comprise the tree. So I think probably the most useful are leaves, because leaves are present on the tree all year long if it's an evergreen, and for about 9 months if it's a deciduous tree. So the leaves are around most of the time. And even once they fall off, you can often find them lying on the ground. And if you can associate them with the tree, you can still use them. Certainly flowers and fruits are very important. A lot of us would easily be able to identify an apple tree by either the flower or the fruit, but they're kind of ephemeral. The flowers only last a couple of weeks and the fruit might last a month at the end of the growing season. And so neither one of them are there as often as regularly as the leaves. Geographic location, if you're assuming you're in the field, the geographic location where you are can be really important. It makes a big difference whether you're on the coast or whether you're in the high Cascades and separating out spruces, for example. It makes a big difference where you are in Washington or Southern Oregon. There's a big difference in the species of trees that grow there. Habitat can also be important. Once you're in a general geographic location, it helps to pay attention to whether the tree you're trying to identify grows on a high, dry ridgetop or a south-facing slope, or whether it grows down at the bottom of the valley along a stream. So the habitat, the specific location in which it grows will help you. And people often ask me to identify things from bark, and I want to say that's can be really helpful, but it's also very difficult. If I just saw the picture of bark that's in the third circle here, I'd be hard pressed to tell you what that is. Bark varies by age tremendously. It varies by whether it's growing in the sun or the shade. It varies by how fast the tree is growing. So bark can be a good identifying characteristic, but often in the context of the other things listed above. And sometimes it's the inner bark rather than the outer bark that can be a good identifying characteristic. It's kind of less subject to all those changing factors that I just mentioned. Next. So, again, I've said it a couple times, but because the Trees to Know Oregon contains 2 tree keys, one for conifers, the cone-bearing, usually cone-bearing and usually evergreen trees are called conifers, and then the ones with the big floppy leaves are called broadleaves. And both of the keys work the same way, but the broadleaf key is quite a bit longer than the conifer key, in large part, not so much because of native trees, but because of the ornamental trees that I've chosen to include in the book, and there are a lot more of those than conifers. So both keys work the same way. You start at the top where it says start here. And start here represents all of the conifers that occur in this book. And then I pick a characteristic that separates those into two, sometimes logical, but it doesn't have to be logical, into two groups. And so, for example, I've chosen to ask whether the leaves are needle-like or whether the leaves are flattened and overlapping. And then, so that breaks it into two distinct groups. And then if the leaves are needle-like, I ask if the needles are clustered or whether they're not clustered, they're arrayed along the length of the twig. And let's say that they're clustered, which is the left choice here. And then we go down and I ask whether the clusters are in needles of 2 to 5 or whether the clusters are greater than 10. And let's say in this case, they're clusters of 2 to 5. So we would reach the hypothesis, at least, that this is a pine tree. And then we would go back to page 42 for the native pines that grow in the Northwest, and page 122 for the ornamental trees, ornamental pine trees that grow in the Northwest. So that's how it works. And now let's look at a specific example. So I'm going to treat this as an unknown conifer, although some of you probably know this well, but we want to look at some of the characteristics here. This branch clearly displays needle-like leaves, and the term leaf and needle can be used interchangeably, but not all conifers have needle-shaped leaves. So in this case, the needles are sharp-pointed. They have parallel sides. If we look at the little picture at the bottom center, we'll see that the needles are arrayed all the way around the twig. In other conifers, they may be clustered on top of the twig. I guess they could be on the bottom, although I've never seen that. And in a lot of cases, they may be flattened into a single plane. But in this case, they're arrayed all the way around the twig. In the upper right, we see a twig without any needles on it. And one thing that we'll notice is that there are some distinctly raised woody pegs. So a logical question might be, what role do those pegs play in the life of the tree? And if you look at the bottom right-hand photograph, you see that there is one needle arising from each of those pegs. And so just with those few characteristics, and maybe not even all of those, we can figure out what this is likely to be. So we're going to key out this particular specimen, and we've included the key photographs down here. So to the question, leaves needle-like or leaves flattened and overlapping, I'm saying the leaves look needle-like. And then I'll ask whether they're clustered or whether they're not clustered, whether they're arrayed along the twig. And I've reached the conclusion for you that they're not clustered, they're actually arrayed along the twig. They don't come in bundles of 2 to 5, nor in bundles of 15 to 30. So the next question is, are the needles short and sharp, or are the needles longer than a ½ inch? Well, you can't tell from the photograph. If you had it in your hand, you could certainly tell. So I'll tell you that the needles are about 1 inch long, so clearly they're longer than 1/2 inch. So the next question asks you to look for tiny pegs on the twig, or do you see no pegs on the twig? And in this case, we see distinct pegs. Okay, so once we see those pegs, the next question is, are the pegs square? And if you're not sure about the square pegs, you can answer the question, are the needles sharp? And the other choice is, are the pegs rounded and the needles are blunt? So there's two ways that you can separate these out. And in this case, the pegs are square and clearly raised and quite stout. So we're going to treat the hypothesis that this is a spruce, and the native spruces are described on page 59, and the several introduced species are described on page 122. And before we leave this picture about spruces, I want you to look in the lower right-hand corner, And on the far right side, you would see what you would all certainly recognize as a cone. This is very typical of a spruce cone. But to the left of that, you might wonder what that is if you see it on the tree. And that's actually the female flower, and technically it's not a flower, but I'm going to call it a flower, of spruce trees. And they start out upright, and then when pollen comes in, and let me see, I probably need to describe this. So all conifers have separate male and female flowers. So the pollen comes from one flower and has to land on the female flower and then travel down into the flower to fertilize the female egg, so to speak. So in spruces, the flowers start out upright so that the female flower can gather pollen floating in on the wind. And then once the seeds are fertilized, they get heavier and they turn down and turn into the cones that you see on the right side. So sorry, that was kind of a long description, but I hope you found it interesting. And we'll look for that in spruces this time of year. And sometimes they're purple, sometimes they're red, sometimes they're green, sometimes they're a combination. Okay, next slide. So we're going back to spruces on page 59. So each of the different genera of conifers, or broadleaves for that matter, are set up the same way. So on the left page, you'll see a description for spruces in general. And the scientific name is Picea, or if you're from Europe, it's Picea, but nonetheless, spruces is what we should use here. And there'll be a description of what characteristics comprise a spruce, what does it take, what characteristics does it take to make a spruce. And I'll tell you how many spruces there are in the world, how many spruces there are in North America, and how many spruces there are in the Northwest. And if you go to the upper part of the right page, you'll see that there are actually 3 spruces that grow in the Pacific Northwest: Brewer spruce, Engelmann spruce, and Sitka spruce. And you'd read those little thumbnail descriptions and make your best guess in terms of which the particular specimen is that you have in your hand. Then we could either read the description on Brewer spruce and then Engelmann spruce, and then next, please. We would finally get to Sitka spruce. Well, here you see Engelmann spruce on the left and Sitka spruce on the right. And each page is set up the same way, where the big block of text is a description, sometimes with identifying characteristics, sometimes with ecological characteristics, sometimes with natural history and ecology of the species, sometimes Native American uses, sometimes early settlement uses by Euro-Americans. So that's what that block does. And then in the right column, in this case, there's a range map, and the dark green color shows the approximate range over which Sitka spruce grows. Now it can be planted other places, but this is the place where it occurs naturally. And then right beneath that map, there are thumbnail descriptions of the size, the leaves or the needles, the fruit, the twigs, the bark. So if you want an easy way to figure out if you're looking at the right thing, that would be the first place to go. So that's how one would key out that particular spruce, and you don't need to know, carry in your head a lot of characteristics about it, although you do need to learn a little bit of terminology. Next, please. So I mentioned a couple other kinds of needles there might be. In the upper left are the fascicled needles of pine trees. So pine trees carry their needles in bundles of 2 or 3 or 5, sometimes 4, and there's one 4-needle pine in the world, and there's one 1-needle pine in the world, but most of them have 2, 3, or 5. And if you look out at the tips of the needles, at the very edges, you can see how the 2 needles twist apart, and that comprises 1 needle split in half that we would call 2 needles because they look like 2 needles. To the right of that, we see the foliage from larch, which is born also in clusters, but there are a lot more needles in those clusters, and the clusters are borne on woody spur shoots. That's typical of larches and true cedars. And then we mentioned way long ago about leaves also, conifer leaves also being flat and overlapping. So we have two examples here where, let's see, I don't know if I had my cursor, I could show this better. So Janet, can you move the cursor down to one of the white bands right below you there? It's a little diamond shaped band in the upper right photo. Go a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, two more. Oh, okay. So each of those X's delineates the edges of 4 needles. There's one on the top, there's one on the bottom, there's one on the left, and there's one on the right. And so those are actually 4 leaves compressed together in a tiny little X pattern as the same thing above. So we might also see different kinds of cones in the conifers. Cones might be large and upright, like the true fir in the lower left-hand corner. That's a noble fir. To the right, true fir cones actually, when the seeds are mature, the cones scales fall off the tree while the cone is still on the tree. So if you look under the tree, you'll see cone shrapnel. Underneath a pine tree, you'll see a woody pine cone. So they can have different degrees of woodiness. Cones can be round or square, like those two in the middle, and they can be some kind of combination of those characteristics, like this huge monkey puzzle cone on the right, which is large, very heavy, upright, deciduous scales that fall apart at maturity. So again, cones come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Okay, next, please. Ooh, what do we have here?
Oh, can we get the sound on for that? One more time, can we turn the sound on?
Oh.
Well,
We're missing out on the spotted owl, so maybe somebody.
Well, this is the sign that somebody is winning this wonderful book. Yeah, this is the silent owl. Thank you, Eileen. But so if your name is Linda, check the chat. There is a chance that you are the Linda who won a copy of this book. And I would attempt the owl hoot, but it'd be incredibly embarrassing, and I don't want this on the internet for posterity.
So our hooting owl is actually a spotted owl, so we wanted everybody to be able to hear that, but it doesn't.
There's another opportunity. Maybe we'll dial it in. Oh. Bummer. Well, we'll move on because this is great. I don't know which Linda it was, but you will get a private chat message, so check the chat.
I think this is the quiz slide, Nicole.
Are we doing a quiz?
Apparently we are. We have the slide in here.
You got a poll.
A poll.
Oh, yeah, we're doing a poll.
Sorry.
Victor. Yeah. Please welcome Victor Villegas to the screen.
Okay, here's the first poll question.
So everybody can go ahead and click that. Do not give the answer in the chat, but click the answer in the poll, and we'll see how informed you all already are.
Answers are coming in. We're at about 66% with folks voting, and people are still voting. 75%.
I hope we don't have any voter suppression going on.
Let's see if we reach 100 here. We're pretty close to it. 81%. That's great. Give it a few more seconds. 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And
Closing the poll. And here are the results.
Yay! Well, I assume red is good.
Red is the majority of folks chose C, sugar pine.
Okay, and the majority of folks are correct. Okay, so next we want to kind of do the same process for broadleaf keys, just so you get an idea that the key is set up the same way, although it looks a little bit differently. So all the broadleaves in the book are at the start, in the Start Here group. And the first choice to make is whether the leaves are compound or the leaves are simple. And Janet's going to help me illustrate with these two on the left that there are two different kinds of compound leaves. And what you need to look for is the woody stem, which she's pointing to now. Can you make a little arc along the woody stem? No, the woody stem below. Yeah, okay, that's one. And the other one's right next to it. And then right above the woody stem is the leaf stem, which is going to be soft tissue as opposed to the woody tissue of the twig. And then multiple leaflets in the one on the left radiate out of a central point, sort of like the fingers off the palm of your hand. And so that leaf form is called a palmately compound. And then if we move to the one to the right, it looks a little different, but it's still compound. It still has, just go down to the short segment that's above the twig, just right there. That is the leaf stem that connects the leaflets to the twig. And then the leaves radiate off of that long central stem, sort of like the veins of a feather come off the center. And that's called pinnately compound, because they're like the pinnae of a feather. So that's compound. And if you go to the right, all the way to the right of the page, the alternative choice is leaves simple. And in that case, the leaves have different shapes, but they all have only one stem connecting them to the twig, and they have only one blade. So just to see how this works, we want to go down to the next choice, and it asks us whether the leaves are opposite one another. Go to the right, Janet, right there. If the leaves come off opposite one another, they're said to be opposite. If they come off in an alternate fashion, like the one on the right, they're said to be alternate. Well, if the leaves are alternate, then you have to go to the next page, which is what the yellow arrow shows. And then you start at the top and you go through the same process. And if you go to the right and say the leaves are not deeply lobed, and then you go to the right again and you say that the edges are not smooth, you go to the next page and get all of the species that meet those criteria. And then you can only go so far with leaves before they start to be a bit befuddling with terminology. And so in a lot of cases, I switched over to fruits in this case. But anyway, the point is showing you that the key works the same way in a methodical fashion from top down all the time. So next slide, please. So here's an example of a broad-leaved plant. Many of you will know it. The point is not that you know it already. The point is to see if we can key it. And Janet, if you can, just move your cursor around that leaf blade on the right side where you are now. So that's the blade of the leaf. It's wide, it's floppy, it's thin. It is connected to the twig by that red stalk at the base, okay? And then if we go back to the blade of the leaf, we'll see that the edges are lobed, that is, they're indented, and they can be indented in a shallow fashion, or they can be very deeply indented almost all the way back to the petiole or the stem of the leaf. And if we look at the edges of the lobes, we'll see that there are teeth on the edges of the lobes, so they're serrated. So all of those characteristics go together to help us describe this particular leaf. And then just a couple of the other pictures here. The upper right shows that this particular tree turns brilliant red, especially in the sun, if it's in the sun in the fall. And a lot of the red comes because chlorophyll is the green pigment that causes photosynthesis, that's hard to say today, to occur. And in the fall, the chlorophyll breaks down and it leaves behind pigments that were there during the year, but they were masked by the darker green color. And some of the pigments, especially oranges, will actually develop once the pigment goes away or as the pigment goes away. So there's slightly different reasons for leaves changing color, but it's a programmed, planned death of the leaf during which the leaf translocates the food that it stored in it during the year back down its stem, back into the twigs, back into the roots to keep the plants alive. And then in the middle one, we see a picture of the double-seeded fruit, where there's a wing on each side. So each of those has a name, of course. Each one is called a samara, but you can just call it a winged fruit if you want. And they're joined together at their head, so it's a double samara. And then below, right, is an example of the flower clusters for this particular specimen. And I wanted to show you that the red things are sepals. They're vegetative, they're kind of like petals, only they're vegetative, like leaves that cover up the flower. The white and yellow are the pollen-bearing parts of the flower. And below, right underneath those, you'll see tiny green double samaras. So in this case, the egg has already been fertile. The eggs have already been fertilized and they're developing into the double samara. And at maturity, they'll look like the photograph above that. And they'll often turn red in color, not always, sometimes they stay green. So I just thought that was a point of interest. We don't really need it to key out the plant. Okay. Education is about so much more than just the pedantic sort of things. Okay, so if we want to key out that plant and we have everything we need in this photograph at the bottom, we would start at the top and ask ourselves, are the leaves compound or are they simple? And we discussed in the previous slide that this is a simple leaf. It has one blade and one stem. So then we'd ask, are the leaves opposite or the leaves alternate? Well, you have to trace back the red stem to the center point, and you'll see the leaf next to it is coming out of the same point. So that's a little hard to see here, but that's an example of these two leaves are growing opposite one another. They're coming out the opposite side of the twig. And that would be true all the way down the stem of the plant. And then the next thing we'd ask, are the leaves lobed or are they not lobed? And in this case, we also describe the lobes. And so it's the one on the left. That's a slide change, Janet. Yep, it's the one on the left. And so the native maples are described on page 102. And some of the introduced maples, there's probably 150 introduced maples that grow here. So there's a lot. So we go back and look at the section on maples. And just like for the spruces, we would read through it. It would tell us what characteristics we need to decide that it, or confirm that it's a maple. It would say how many maples there are in the world. There's 13 in North America. There's 4 in the Northwest. And the 4 we have, 2 grow as large trees and 2 grow as large shrubs, but occasionally small trees. So we would read through all of that stuff and we would reach the conclusion that vine maple on the next page is the species that we were trying to key out. So we're confirming our hypothesis that we made during the keying process. And again, you'll see the map with the dark green is where vine maple occurs natively. And below that are thumbnail descriptions for the characteristics of the plant. Okay, next. Please. Excuse me a second. So there are lots and lots of different kinds of shapes of leaves and arrangements of leaves. And so I couldn't show them all, so we'll just show a couple. So in the upper left is also a simple leaf, one stem, one blade, and it is lobed, but it's lobed very differently from the vine maple that we saw. Some people would say it looks like a tulip, and its scientific name is my favorite scientific name for all plants. It's Liriodendron tulipifera. So it's a tulip-like lily tree is how that translates out. Anyway, those of us in my age group and Jim's age group might recognize that as the facial characteristics for a cartoon figure known as Betty Boop. No? Okay. All right, so if we drop down, still on the left side and drop down, we'll see an example of a palmately compound leaf. So again, the red stem at the top is the stem that connects all of these leaflets back to the twig. And then radiating out of that central point, like fingers out of your hand, are leaflets. And they have different sizes and different shapes that are characteristic for individual species. So this is palmately compound. And then if we move to the center, lower one, this is an example of an ash tree where the leaves are pinnately lobed. So Janet, if you could go back to the center point of the right there and just draw down about an inch along there and, oops, sorry, go back up to the center point. But just keep going up a little bit more. We can make it work with where you are. Right there, stop. Right there is the stem of the leaf that connects the leaf to the twig. And then the rest of them are pinnately compound leaflets that come off the continuation of the stem. And if we look at, Janet, move your cursor just a little to the left and up a little bit, we would see that each of these two leaves come off in an opposite fashion. So these leaves are pinnately compound and arranged oppositely on the tree. Again, a little hard. There's another one in the way that kind of, yeah, thank you. Okay, then to the lower right, this is another kind of a simple leaf with one blade and one leaf stalk. It has a very different shape. It's unlobed, and we're looking at the bottom of the leaf, and we actually see here that there's a golden fuzziness on the bottom of the leaf that would help us identify this as golden chinkapin. So again, hundreds of shapes of leaves, if not more. And we all have a sense of what flowers look like, but a really interesting in the Northwest is in the upper center picture. And this is the flower of Pacific dogwood, which many of you would recognize. And we would almost all call this a flower, but in fact, it's an inflorescence, which means it's a set of flowers arranged in a particular way. So the flowers are very tiny, and they are situated in this little pincushion in the center of what we would call petals. So each of those there's 40 or 50 flowers in there, none of which has a petal. And so in order to attract pollinators, the leaves have become white and surround the set of flowers in the inflorescence. So those are called bracts, which just means they're modified leaves. So it's actually a leaf that turns white and surrounds this cluster of flowers. And then again, we're all used to looking at fruits, but this strange one on the right is the fruit of this Pacific dogwood. And here you can see that these individual flowers have developed into these, at least potentially into these individual seeds that Janet's highlighting right there with her cursor. So there's one that's pretty ripe. So again, fruits can come in all sorts of odd shapes and sizes, and they make one of the things that make learning about trees interesting is that you start to notice these sorts of things. Okay, where do we go from here? What's next? Okay, so there's also a section for some of you learning to identify trees as an end in itself. Some of you like to learn about trees because you're really interested in forests. And trees are one of the main organisms that comprise a forest, but there are many, 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 many other organisms that are key to forests. So in the book, we've chosen to describe a number of specific forest types that occur in Northwest forests. And I want to make clear there's no single way to describe types of forests. There are many different types for many different purposes. So we've chosen a type that seems to make sense to us. And so this is an example of a Douglas fir Western hemlock forest. There's a lot of old growth in the background, but there are some younger stands in the foreground. So this is the type of forest that when Lewis and Clark came to the Northwest in the early 1800s, most of the mountains west of the crest of the Cascades and some of the mountains east of the crest of the Cascades were covered with forests that look like this. Now, if you went higher in elevation, the forests would look very different. They'd be more sparse. They'd have different species of trees. They'd be more open. If you go lower elevations to the broad valleys of Western Oregon and Washington, the landscape was dominated by floodplains and swampy lands where these trees would not grow, but there would be different species of ashes and maples and those sorts of things. But this, for the Western Oregon, Washington area, this was the dominant type. Well, we all know that lots of changes have occurred since Lewis and Clark. There's been a lot of timber harvesting that's occurred, both for the value of the timber, to create suburbs, to create highways, et cetera, but there might be some comfort to know that a large portion of the land that was covered by Western hemlock Douglas fir forests in 1800 is still covered by Douglas fir Western hemlock forest. Probably 75 or 80% of that land is still covered with those forests. But the forests have changed a lot. They've become a lot younger, they've become a lot more uniform, some of them have become genetically modified. I take comfort in the fact that in the Pacific Northwest, about 10% of the old growth forests that existed when Lewis and Clark came still exist in the Northwest. And that doesn't sound, 10% doesn't sound like very much. It's a huge amount. If you go to the temperate forests of Eastern North America and you go to a stand of old growth, it might be an acre in size. And we just have this vast amount. So anyway, I love, this is what got me interested in forestry, was some work experience in Olympic National Park in this forest type. Okay, too much on that, sorry. So if we go east of the crest of the Cascades, Ponderosa pine is almost as common and important there as Douglas fir is, and Nicole has a couple comments to make about Ponderosa pine forests.
Oh, I think the most drastic thing you'll notice if you are from the west side of Oregon and you come over to the east side of the Cascades to our Ponderosa pine forest is the drastic shift in density. We can hold a lot less trees on this landscape due to different soils and different precipitation. We just get a lot less rain, and our soils don't hold water very well. But what's really cool about these forests is the way they've adapted to fire. And you'll find fire scars on our big old pines, and then the importance of openings to provide sunlight in areas for grasses, shrubs, and flowering plants to grow, and which provides really important wildlife habitat. And I could go on all evening about Ponderosa pine forests, but they're worth a gander.
Well, let me ask you one question, if I may. So
Yeah.
this understory is pretty open. Is that typical for Ponderosa pines, or is it a result of something in particular?
This one's pretty open. It looks like it's probably been thinned and burned. I see some cut marks, and yeah, you'd see vast areas of Ponderosa pine that were quite open. We called them gappy, patchy, clumpy. It depend on how fire operated in the landscape, and if there were like lava fields protecting an area, then you'd have a patch of protected dense trees. But yeah, a large percentage of these Ponderosa pine forests would have been quite open, and it looks like some younger bitter brush growing underneath the trees, which needs that regular fire to stay lush and palatable for ungulates.
So what might happen to this forest if fire was eliminated and if timber harvest thinning did not occur? Would it look like this, or would it?
It'd get filled in with a lot of little black barked Ponderosa pine trees or really tall bitter brush. And you see a lot of stands that look like that, a lot of forests around here that look like that because we first harvested all the big trees out and then took fire out of the equation. And so you see really dense, dark, sickly looking trees.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take a quick look at Western juniper, and I'm going to call them woodlands rather than forests, because forests typically have trees with closed canopies where the crowns touch, and Western juniper, typically the trees are more open and interspersed with grasses or shrubs. And this is actually a pretty good example of what Western juniper woodlands would look like at the time that Lewis and Clark came. Of course, the shed wouldn't be there, but Western juniper is very sensitive to fire, and so it typically the trees did not grow close together. If they did, they'd burn up. So they grew in a very much more open situation like this, and often on shallow, rocky soils that had a hard time carrying fire, so they were actually protected by the fire. Now, however, our juniper woodlands often look like this. Because of fire suppression, the trees are much closer together and the stands are much denser. And kind of an interesting fact is that the Pacific Northwest has almost as much forest land in forests, as it did when Lewis and Clark came. And that is largely because the Western juniper woodlands have expanded so greatly, especially in central Oregon, but a bit in central Washington and Northern California. They've expanded so greatly due to fire suppression. We stop the burning and the trees are able to grow much more closely together. So this is actually creating a problem for water conservation in central and eastern parts of the Northwest, for wildlife habitat, and for fire danger, because the fires can burn longer and hotter. But this is what they would look like now. Next. And then just to show that normally we think of conifers as being evergreen trees. The Northwest is blessed with western larch and subalpine larch, which are actually deciduous conifers. And almost every year while I was working, I would get a note or a letter from somebody asking what was wrong with the trees as they came across the Cascades. It looked like they were all dying, and they were just looking at the western larch stands there. You can see that western larch forests are not particularly common in Oregon. They become more common as you go north into Washington and over into Idaho. And the same would be true for subalpine fir, which grows at high elevations, hence the name subalpine. It becomes more common as you go north, even into central British Columbia and Alberta. So next. So then just to quickly mention, there is a section, because many of the trees that you will encounter on a daily basis as you walk along city streets and in parks, and the trees that you use for planting around your homes are not native trees to the Northwest. They're often introduced from other parts of the world. So there's a section in the book that contains 60 or 70 common or interesting trees that are planted ornamentally. They're not native here, but they plant here. Some of them grow very well here. The Northwest, especially the west side, is blessed with this maritime climate in which almost anything can grow. The east side, which is drier and hotter and colder both, is a harsher environment, but still a lot of the city trees are ornamental trees. And so the ornamentals originally mostly came from the eastern United States. Now it's a combination of the eastern United States and Eastern Asia for the most part. Okay, next.
Oh, we know what the blank screen means.
Can we get it to work yet, Victor?
Well, Janet, are you able to stop sharing the screen and reshare and to make sure that the audio is turned on?
We're going to do a little adaptive management here, which is our forestry term for tweaking. I do.
All right, let's test it. Huh.
Okay, let's just skip it and go to
Está bien. We're all good. I do know that if your name is Chris and you live in Oregon, and if your name is Angela and you live in Oregon, you should really pay attention to the chat. We're giving away 2 books this time. And we'll keep this show going because we're running a little bit behind, Ed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so do we want to do the poll? No, let's skip the poll. Okay, so we have many questions, many concerns about how a changing climate might affect forests. So I've asked my colleague, Dave Shaw, who is a forest health specialist who works for the College of Forestry and Extension, to help me write a section that would help us understand some ways in which forests of the Northwest might change. And so I'm going to ask him to step in here and enlighten us with that. Dave?
Oh, well, thank you very much, Ed, and hello, everybody. Again, yeah, I'm David Shaw. I'm a forest health specialist with Forestry and Natural Resources Extension here in the College of Forestry at Oregon State. Climate change is somewhat like the elephant in the room whenever you're talking about trees and tree growth and tree ecology nowadays, because we fear that there could be some real negative implications of climate change on tree health overall. And so it's something we want to talk about. However, it's incrementally happening, and there are some general predictions for the near future. And of course, 100, 150, 200 years from now, we have no idea what might be happening. But in the near future, there's a few key things that most people agree may be happening. And one of those is that we're going to be seeing hotter, drier summers with increased temperatures and decreased growing season precipitation potentially. In addition to that, we may see increased longer growing seasons. So this just from beginning earlier in the spring is beginning earlier and fall seems to be ending later. Those kind of things that can really influence the potential for drying fuels and fire. In addition, we also think we may be seeing some warmer, wetter winters, or at least warmer winters. These increased temperatures will likely increase snowpack and the ability of the mountains to hold more snow in the winter. And so decreased snowpack is something that could strongly influence our mountain forests. In this particular photograph, we're looking at oak woodlands, and you can see meadows there. The meadow is likely a result of possibly fire and shallow soils or rocky, harsh soil sites, so trees can barely grow there. We anticipate in Western Oregon and in the oak zone in particular, and we anticipate sort of an increase in broadleaves such as oak, possibly madrone, and maybe tan oak in Oregon, and possibly some movement from Northern California of some of the tree species into Oregon, in particularly Southern Oregon, and an increase in the broadleaves in general, and a decrease in conifers, particularly in these low elevation oak habitats. And we've been seeing that already, particularly in Southwest Oregon. They're in the Medford Valley and Grants Pass area. We're seeing a lot of conifer mortality where it grows with oak. And this is associated with bark beetles and flat-headed fir borer. So that's some of the implications on the west side. Next, Another big thing that's often discussed with climate change is bark beetles and whether they're killing more trees than they normally would. And over the last 20 years, bark beetles have the magnitude and widespread severity of bark beetles does appear to be outside what we would consider our historical norm, but it's complicated by just seasonal weather patterns, and it's also complicated by forest management and structure of the forest due to fire suppression and various things that have happened on the landscape. But it's generally thought that bark beetles will be, because they respond to drought in particular and increased tree stress, that bark beetle activity will increase. This particular picture comes from South Central Oregon. This is Lodgepole Pine in the Pumice Plain, in the Pumice Plain, just along the east slope of the Cascades. And the mountain pine beetle rolls through these stands probably every 30 years or so. The stands that have older trees that are a certain size, a minimum size of about 9 inches or more, tend to be very susceptible to these beetles when they're in outbreak. And the outbreak, again, is often associated with drought and other kind of stressors. But in this particular case, one of the lessons we have seen from the West over the last 20 years is, even though the bark beetle has killed, the mountain pine beetle in particular in Lodgepole Pine has killed a lot of stands, Lodgepole Pine is still one of the dominant features of the surviving stand. So in this case, you really see a lot of large dead trees, but the tallest and largest trees are dead. But if you look between those, you'll see there's still a lot of surviving lodgepole pine in the smaller size classes. So we anticipate lodgepole pine will persist in this particular stand, and eventually these larger trees will die and fall over, and then these younger trees will mature, so that the stand is not necessarily going to be converted by this bark beetle outbreak. Next slide. All of this is really complicated, of course, and there's a lot of conjecture and a lot of research going on right now, a lot of modeling on what's going to happen to our forests. In addition to, biological types of events, we also anticipate wildfire is going to increase in severity, and the number of acres that we see burned is going to increase also. And this is associated with the increased temperature, and particularly the increased length of the growing season, and the ability of the physical environment to dry these fuels out. Some people are discussing that there's been sort of a aridification or a drying of the West, and our Western forests tend to be these longer, drier, hotter growing season has increased the potential for fire. The implication of these larger, higher severity fires could be that there's, more smoke for us to deal with. It may influence the general ideas or predictions we had about carbon sequestration on our landscapes. If the fire is really huge and the severity areas are really large, it can influence the revegetation of those sites, because there's no seed source that is close enough to have windblown seed dispersed into the center of some of these large high severity patches. So that's always a big concern. And along those lines, there's some predictions that there can be the potential for some site conversions due to fire, where forests may not be able to regrow back for even a number of years, or maybe permanently removed from some of the harsher sites. So these kinds of things are some of the things we think about, but it's really difficult to predict how climate change is actually going to play out. In some parts of the West, like up in northern British Columbia, the summer rainfall has actually increased in some areas, and they think this is a climate change attribute, and that has influenced foliage diseases and other things, but it again would then reduce the potential for fire if we had more summer rainfall, unless of course lightning was a big piece of that. So I think I'll end there because we are close to running out of time, and I just wanted to bring up a few of the key factors that we sense might be important for climate change in our forests.
Yep, so I think we're open for questions.
Yeah, we are going to stay on till 7:30 if anybody wants to hang out and chat. We have some questions that we've been compiling through registration, and we might be able to take some of these chat conversations. And just to clarify, Susan, when we talk about site conversion, it's something like a Ponderosa pine forest becoming a ceanothus and bitterbrush shrub community, because there's one no seed, and then competition from the shrubs over time make it really hard for trees to come back in. So on that note, let's switch the tone a little bit. Ed, I got my Trees to Know in Oregon book. I'm real excited to go practice. Where is the spot where I can go and see the most diversity number of tree species in a small space, least amount of walking? Where are the most diverse areas to go check out?
Probably in those parameters, I would head to the area of the high Cascades between Tombstone Pass and Santa Am Pass. There are some fairly flat areas where you can get around Hackelman Creek and Lost Lake Campground. And it's been a long time since I've counted, but I'm going to say there's at least 16 different species that grow there. Another place that's a little less accessible is in southwestern Oregon between Ashland and Jacksonville, with about the same number of species, but sometimes different species involved. And the reason for these two places, so I'd like to comment on Washington because I love the state of Washington, but I think the flora there, the tree flora, is a little less diverse. And that's because in Oregon, along the Cascades and in southwestern Oregon, three large floras come together. A flora that originated in, I'm going to say Baja California or somewhere around there, and came up through California and kind of just crosses the border into Oregon, maybe up to Central Oregon. There's a Rocky Mountain flora that originated in Mexico and came up the spine of the Rockies, and it moves westward again into those same areas. And then those same areas have the Northwest flora, which kind of developed in place. And so we have three major floras coming together, and primarily central and southwestern Oregon. In Washington, you have much less influence. I won't say no influence, but you don't, for example, get the Californian flora moving up into Washington. You get some of the Rocky Mountain and some of the Northwest flora. Thank you. And they're both fun places to go because they're so diverse.
Yeah, no, I love that old Cascade Crest area around Tombstone and Santa Am. It's pretty, both these places are pretty rugged, but it's worth it. I'm not as lazy as I made myself sound. Let's see, so many good questions. We got a question about what we mean by fire suppression. Dave, can you take a quick stab at that one?
Sure. The classic example of where fire suppression has really been an important thing is in the Ponderosa pine forest, particularly on the east side of Oregon and Washington. And there we used to have a common fire return interval in those forests was, between 4 and 20 years perhaps. And when Europeans came to the region, over 100 years ago, they saw fire as a threat to the forest, and they began to put out all the fires that occurred. And then they also made the Native Americans stop with their routine burning, which they used to do to maintain habitat and food plants and that kind of thing. So fire almost fire was very common throughout Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, in the Southwest Oregon, in the Eastern Oregon and Washington, and same with the Puget Trough. And it basically ceased about 100 to 120 years ago. And then now we're having fire, but we consider most of our forests have a fire deficit. But I think that that's what we mean by fire suppression, is the natural and the human managed fires that occurred prior to European settlement basically stopped. And now we have a big change has happened in the vegetation because there's no common fires, particularly in these certain types of forest systems.
Good job, Dave. Thank you. Ed, this might be a quick one. Do you know if the trees in Oswald West State Park are old growth trees? And that could be a yes or a no.
Yes, I do. So, but no, I don't. So it's a little bit more complicated. So old growth is a characteristic of stands of trees and not a characteristic of individual trees. You can have big old trees, but not necessarily an old growth forest, because an old growth forest may require different things like different sets of species, different heights of canopies, large down woody debris. So I know that Oswald West has big old Sitka spruces, but I don't know the characteristics that comprise a Sitka spruce old growth forest. So I guess I don't.
That's a beautiful answer. Well, we're coming into budding and leafing season, but how do you identify trees in the winter if you can't reach the leaves?
For me, I assume.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's kind of two parts to that. One is if it's a deciduous tree, in which case it's lost its leaves, and I'll take that one first. So the first thing that I would typically do is look around on the ground, because you may find withered leaves that you can unfold and figure out what they look like, and you might even be able to key them out. You can tell how the leaves are arrayed on the twigs, whether they're opposite or alternate, by looking at the twigs themselves and seeing where the leaf scars are or the buds are, because they both follow the same pattern. You might find fruits on the ground, especially if it's a hard fruit, like an acorn or a nut of some kind. And so I'd first look at the ground. Bark can help once you get to know bark characteristics, but it's really hard to read a description of the bark and figure out if that's the bark that you're looking at. So I think I described that before. So if kind of the same thing's true if you're looking at an evergreen tree, you're looking at Douglas fir that's 250 feet tall and you can't tell it's a Douglas fir tree. The first thing I do is look around on the ground for needles, branches, cones, and try and guess whether they came off of that tree. And with the larger conifers, a lot of times bark is a good characteristic, both the external bark, and if you take a knife and take a little piece of the inside bark, you can often tell what it is by the color of the layers of bark. And those will often be described for you in Trees to Know. So you don't have to carry all that around in your head. So it's kind of like being a little bit of a tree detective a little bit. You look for different clues.
Yeah, and bets can be off when you're in a park or in an urban setting, but in a forest, I always start with where am I in the world? What elevation am I at? What mountain range am I in? And that can kind of help narrow it down a little bit. And then you can start looking for other clues from there.
Yep. Okay.
What is the easiest way to buy this book? Well, that's a great question. You can buy the book online from the Oregon State University Extension Service catalog, or if your county is in low or moderate risk, You might be able to call and make an appointment or schedule a time to pop into the office. A lot of our offices have the books in stock, Trees to Know and Shrubs to Know, and you can buy them there. But I suggest calling your office first and see if they are open to the public or by appointment only, or you can order it online.
I would add to that with this particular edition, a lot more effort has been put into making the book available from online sellers, but the price is usually pretty similar. And if you buy it from the Extension Service, you greatly benefit the Extension Service, where if you buy it from an online seller, they don't get that benefit. And they've put a lot into the development of this book.
I also like to give this book away as a housewarming gift to people who are new to the area, or as holiday gifts, if you have nerdy friends like I do. Speaking of books, we have our last book giveaway. So if your name is Tim of Oregon or Les of Oregon, also we're not discriminating against our Washingtonian friends here. It's just worked out this way by sheer volume. Tim and Les of Oregon, check the chat. Somebody might be asking you for your address to send you a book. All right. Hey, Dave, we get questions a lot about how to plant trees today with a future world in mind. Do you have any tips for that or resources to point folks to?
Well, that's one of the most difficult questions we're actually up against right now, and there aren't a lot of resources. It's very site specific, and we often talk about the right tree for the right place. So it's understanding this place where you want to plant the tree, and then researching which trees might be tolerant of the expected conditions. So you know, it's possible, for example, that on the west side here, we have Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine. It may do a lot better in some of the drier sites, summer drier sites than Douglas fir will. And so you might, depending on the specific site, you might consider, you know, Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine over Douglas fir, possibly bringing in something like incense cedar, although we're right at the edge of the range of incense cedar. So it's very nuanced, and it's very difficult to have sort of an easy sort of answer to that question. I'd maybe even toss it to Ed to comment on that answer. What do you think, Ed? I mean, I think it's very difficult to make an overall prediction.
I agree with that totally. For trees that are not going to be in a situation where you can actively maintain them, that is, water them. If they're in your yard, or if they're in a park, if they're along the street and you have access to water and you can water them, you can still grow in the future. I think you'll be able to grow almost anything. It's not like the temperature is going to jump 20 degrees where all of a sudden you have to go from conifers to palm trees. But if you're talking about forest trees, it is very hard to predict because we don't know whether things are really going to get hotter and drier, hotter and wetter, etc., as you described before. Yeah.
This presentation might just be a gateway for some of you. So listed here are a bunch of resources that you can keep geeking out on past this evening. Let's see, more questions. Do you recommend, and this question could be for both of you gentlemen, do you recommend planting native trees in your home environment, home landscape?
So I would say, again, it's kind of a yes and no sort of a thing. It depends very much on how big your home landscape is, you know, whether you've got acres or whether you've got a small city lot. So kind of the smaller your lot, the harder it is to use many of the native species because they get too big, they grow too fast. In some cases, the wood is too soft, and so they fall apart too soon. In some, you can take a perfectly beautiful tree like noble fir that grows really well at 4,000 or 5,000 feet. It's a native tree. You bring it down to the Willamette Valley. It'll grow really nicely for 20 years, and then it'll die of root rot. And so some native trees, yes, some native trees, no. If you planted, it's not really native here, but giant sequoia is one of the biggest offenders that I see in city yards. People don't realize that it will grow 6 feet in diameter in 30 years. And it just keeps getting bigger from there. It's not that it grows so tall. In fact, in the 1980s, for some reason, I very frequently got emails from Europe of people that had, they say, we've got this giant sequoia planted right on the corner of this cathedral or this castle that's 600 or 1,000 years old, and the giant sequoia is pushing up the foundation. What do we do? And I say, well, you've got a building that's 500 or 1,000 years old, and giant sequoia was only discovered by Europeans during the California gold rush of 1850. So your tree can't be older than about 150 years. So it's an easy decision for me whether I want to preserve an antique, so to speak, building, or whether I want to do a tree. But giant sequoia, for example, will outgrow almost all of its environments unless you're out in a country setting along a lane or something like that. So it's kind of a yes or no. On the other hand, Pacific dogwood makes a very nice small tree. It's flowering, it turns beautiful red in the fall. It is subject to some diseases that the Asian dogwoods are not, but nonetheless, you can usually use it successfully. So it depends on a lot of factors. And tree nurseries are pretty good sources of information from that. I'm not sure what Extension offers on city tree planting. A lot of cities have urban foresters, and they will help you pick a tree that's right for your property.
And some homeowner associations even have recommended pallets. I've worked with several communities here in Central Oregon that have a fire-wise plant recommendation list, more fire-resistant plant guides and fire-resistant trees. So lots of resources for planting the appropriate tree. So writing a book usually involves a little bit of research, or a lot of research. You know a lot of things, Ed, but you didn't just know everything automatically that's in this book. Is there anything, what was the most interesting things that you learned in preparing to write this edition of this book?
Well, for this book, without a doubt, the most interesting thing was learning more about these rare species growing in southwestern Oregon. I knew very little about them, and because most of them are pretty common in California, and because they're just crossing the border right at the Oregon border, I kind of assumed that they were moving northward due to climate change. They were being pushed north by a warming climate or something. Well, it turns out that most of them have been here from the Pleistocene or pre-Pleistocene times, even though some of them are the cypresses in particular, are so rare that one species may only have one specimen left in Oregon, and another species may have a really small grove somewhere. And that makes them real subject to risk by wildfire. A fire could wipe out the entire population of any of these rare species. And in some cases, they grow in riparian situations where a flood could wipe them out. So anyway, learning about these new rare trees was certainly the most interesting thing for me about this particular edition.
Cool. Dave.
I knew a lot about the other stuff, so if I hadn't known that, then it all would have been equally important and interesting.
Dave, do you have any tidbits that struck you during this process?
Well, of course, I only participated in a very small way in the book. Thinking about climate change, though, I think one of the things that really, might worry me the most, I guess, is the snowpack issue and how that may influence our Pacific silver fir and noble fir forests, which are very snow dependent forests. And so, I mean, I think, those are some of the forests that I might worry about the most if we don't get snowpack. This year, it looks like we have a decent snowpack. It might not be exceeding normal or anything, but we have some decent snowpack in the mountains. So I'm pretty hopeful for this season. But in 2015, we had an incredible snow drought in the mountains, and a repeat of that kind of year on a regular basis would be potentially catastrophic for us.
Dave, I'm a skier, so I have some, in addition to the ecological reasons to want a good snowpack, I have some selfish ones. And this year's been great. We have a ton of snow in the mountains, but we've gotten very little precipitation at lower elevation. I maybe shoveled my driveway twice this winter. It's so dry down here. And we had a big wind event Sunday evening, which demonstrated two things. One was the dangers of leaving some native trees in homes. We had a lot of Ponderosa pine tops break off onto houses or fall over. And we had 2 wildfires in March.
Whoa.
One was 200 acres in the Bull Springs area from same site as the 2 Bulls fire. So yeah, we're seeing.
Yeah. Eastern Oregon's still in a drought right now. So it's.
Yeah.
I'd like to tag team on to something that Dave said, just to give an illustration that I think might drive it home to people. And Dave, you should feel free to comment on this too, because you mentioned you were concerned about the lack of snowpack's impact on high elevation species like silver fir and noble fir. And one example I use to describe this potential impact on my students is to ask them to look at the top of Mary's Peak, which is the highest point in the Coast Range and just west here from Corvallis. And at the very top of that mountain, the top, I'm gonna say 500-ish feet, there's a stand of beautiful, strikingly beautiful noble fir. And they are there because Mary's Peak, the noble fir likes a cool, moist climate, both summer and winter, and it depends on heavy snowpack. And that describes the climate of Mary's Peak perfectly. And in fact, the young seedlings of noble fir actually commonly germinate on the snow. That is, the seeds fall on the snow, they get moist, they send out their little root, and as the snow melts, it comes down in contact with the soil, and the little seeds start to grow into trees. So the question is, what happens if that environment, so they're at the very top of the mountain, and there's almost no noble firs south of there. There are noble firs on mountaintops north of there. So what happens if the climate gets warmer and drier? What happens to the big trees? They often become weaker. They may be subject to more and different insect attacks. Their rooting substrate changes dramatically in terms of moisture. So they're going to die sooner over time. I'm hypothesizing all of this, so you feel free to comment. And if there is really less snowpack, germination of the seedlings, of the seeds into seedlings is going to become less successful. And there is somebody left to follow the big noble firs as they fall down, and it's likely to be Western hemlock. And then you'll have to go farther north in the range of noble fir to find noble fir. What do you think about that scenario? Anybody in the group?
Yeah, I would concur. The interesting thing though is that there's been the population up there has been healthy enough to be invading the meadow, and they've actually, to maintain the wildflowers and the plant diversities of the meadows adjacent to the noble fir, they've actually started to control noble fir and cut it back to the grove. So it's a fascinating area that way. The only other thing I would add, Ed, would be that mountain really, if you notice it a lot of times has a cap of clouds on it, and it's that noble fir stand's also, in my mind, kind of a cloud forest.
Yeah.
The foliage is set up where the impaction of the fog into the stand actually increases crown drip, and you get the equivalent of more water transferred to the stand than if it was just raining. And so that cloud cap is another thing that might be threatened by warming temperatures. The elevation of those cloud caps might increase. So, but yeah, I think that's a fascinating stand there, and it's right at the top of the mountain. And climate change may begin to have an effect on that stand in the future.
Lovely. Thank
I,
you.
I think that the noble fir and the draws up there will persist longer than on the upper slopes,
Right.
just because water flows downhill.
Usually.
Yeah,
Pretty much,
I would agree.
except when it doesn't.
And this is a soil scientist talking to us.
So that we don't
So
end
he would know.
so that we don't end on gloom and doom, Nicole, I'd like you to reflect on your 70 years here as a forester in the Pacific Northwest, since the book is 70 years old, and maybe make a comment or two on what you think some significant changes, maybe positive changes in forestry have been over those 70 years since you were a young girl here.
Well, the beauty about forestry is you can be middle-aged and still be young in the forestry world compared to some of our trees. And it's true, I haven't been here 70 years, but from what I understand of our history of forest management here, I'd say some things that I think are positive to look forward to is that, one, as scientists and land managers, we are just learning so much, and we're becoming more nuanced. We're more adaptable and holistic about how we talk about forest ecosystems anymore. We don't call trees timber, hopefully, until they're on a log truck going somewhere. If you're in the field with me and you call some trees timber, I'll call you on it, and hopefully some other people will too. So we're more receptive to all the values and all the reasons to care about forests. And I think as a society, just evidenced by how many people probably had to spend all day on Zoom and then came here to learn about trees and forests this evening, I think our society is becoming more curious and aware of their impact on the ecosystem they live in, and are participating more. I see people coming and showing up for forest collaborative meetings, field tours. They're volunteering for trail stewardship, river stewardship, watershed stewardship. I think our communities aren't taking our land where we live for granted anymore, and able to make some more informed versus emotional reactions to management. For example, prescribed burning around here, a lot more support than even 10 years ago. So those are some things that I'm hopeful for. If we work together, if we're engaged and active and curious and nimble, then we can be more responsive in a rapidly changing world.
I think the Friends of the Metolius is a great example of a group that has been very proactive over, a couple decades, I think.
Yeah. I think, did that start with Tim Lilleboe?
Pardon?
Do you know if that started with Tim Lilleboe?
I'm not sure who initially.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's another story for another evening. Well, hey, Ed Jensen, Dave Shaw, thank you so much. Janet Donnelly, Anne Marie Murphy, Victor Villegas, thank you so much for helping this show, making the show happen. You just have us three foresters here tonight. It'd be a different show for sure. Thank you so much, Ed.
And if there's anybody left in the audience, thank you.
Oh, there's still 80 people. This is dedication. I love that we have so many passionate dendrologists in Oregon and Washington.
We also have
everyone-
64 people watching on YouTube right now. So.
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you all for participating this evening. This will be available as a recorded event, and pick up a book through the OSU Extension catalog or from your OSU Extension office. Always good to check out where that is. You might need us someday. And yeah, lots of videos and other resources available on the Extension website. So